Story 1. I grew up with my face pressed against aquariums and tide tables. My mother taught me to name every shell in the cabinet, and by the time I was old enough to hold a microscope, I could spot a copepod in a glass of pond water. That's how I ended up a biologist, with a weakness for edge places. The margins of brackish marshes, freshwater swamps, that soft in-between ground where the land forgets what it wants to be. Jay Whitlock, my friend, my fishing partner, the only man I ever knew who could weld steel with the same tenderness he handled a tackle box, went to the marshes for the silence. I went because I looked for things no one else wanted to name. We'd been going to the Kenai marshes for years, a thaw season ritual when the ice loosened its grip and the fish remembered how to move. Jay would tie off the kayak, check the lines, rub a little oil into the paddles, and complain about the mosquitoes like they were an old joke. He liked slow water, the way you can sit and listen to nothing for an entire afternoon. I liked how the marsh hid things, living things, dead things, things that might not be either. We traded our reasons for being there the way men pass cigarettes. A little pride, a little denial. That march had been too warm. The ice was retreating in strange shapes, like someone had cut holes in the world and then forgotten to sweep up. We went out at midday under a sun that felt like an apology, bright but gentle, still unable to warm your bones. My new satellite phone, an expensive device I'd bought for research, slipped from my hand when I leaned down to grab a pair of forceps. It hit the water and vanished with a dull plop. I cursed and watched the black screen sink, and Jay shook his head without even turning. "Want me to get it?" he asked. "No, don't." It sounded cowardly when I said it, and Jay knew me too well. He laughed, that low sound he used when he wanted to make my worry smaller. "You're not going to let them take your gear, Nolan. I know you." He pushed the kayak closer to the bank until his boots sank into the soft muck. The water was freezing. The air smelled like old reeds and something even colder, like the inside of a big freezer. He waded in up to his thighs despite my protests, because he always had to be the one to rescue other people's mistakes, because sometimes he was better at that than I was. I remember how he moved at first, carefully, fingers feeling under the surface streaked with meltwater. His hands disappeared and reappeared like a man fishing for something heavy. Out there we had rules. No sudden movements, no yelling, keep the kayak steady. But curiosity weighs more than rules when something you paid for slips away and gets lost. Then the water around him darkened. It wasn't mud kicked up by his feet, but a shadow moving under the surface. Impossible in a channel that shallow. At first I thought it was a log, then a deeper shape. A line under the water that didn't match the outline of anything we'd seen before. Jay went still. The hair on his forearms rose in a way that makes me think of other animals when they feel a storm coming. He said my name and his voice sounded different. Thin, quick. A short laugh slipped out like someone surprised by fear. Something wrapped his ankle. It was deliberate and fast, like a latch snapping shut. I saw the movement where his boot touched the water, a jerk that wasn't caused by the current. Jay's body pitched forward as if a rope had gone taut. He went down, the water swallowing the sound, and the world narrowed to the desperate, purely manual task of reaching. I lunged with the paddle, leaned too far. The kayak tipped toward me like a small boat, apologizing for its size. I had to balance with one hand and stretch out the other. For a long second, everything was just distance and the sound of my own breathing. He surfaced again about 50 feet away, coughing like he'd been down too long. He came up in a spray of marsh water, hands clinging to the paddle. His face had already lost its color. Gasping was the only thing he could do. His pant leg was shredded around the calf. The skin underneath looked damaged and weeping. Something long and thick, a slick muscular thing, slid off his leg and vanished into the reeds as if it belonged to the mud. "What?" What the hell? He choked out. Water dripped from his eyelashes. It grabbed Nolan. It grabbed me. I didn't go back. I'm not sure why. Maybe because going back felt like walking into a trap you'd just seen snap shut. Maybe because the kayak was already an argument between balance and intention, and I didn't want to lose both. We paddled like our lives depended on it, because they did. He was sobbing. I hummed small, useless jokes until his shoulders stopped shaking so hard. When we reached shore, I took photos with trembling hands and tried to keep the facts clear in my head. The cut on his calf had a strange pattern, not like bites, not like the clean slash of a propeller, but as if something had frayed rope where muscle should have been. My training told me to take samples, to bring tissue, to watch toxin markers. My instinct told me to get him to a clinic. We drove like men who have seen the edge of a map, in silence under the radio. At the hospital, they stitched him up, asked the standard questions about animal attacks. We gave answers that sounded like a bad fishing story. I started digging. I checked marsh species records and old field notes. I scrolled through anglers' forums that keep stories the way some people keep keys. I called a university archivist who had access to indigenous oral histories and field journals. Nothing matched what I saw. There were mentions in very old texts of water creatures with long constricting bodies, but they were folklore entries, written in that tone of educated distance and skepticism. Scientists use Latin names and measurements. Stories use hunger and weather as measurements. One thing lodged under my skin, a note in an interview with footnoted references, with an elder who once warned a research team about poking around in the marsh channels. He said, "The marsh feeds on the curious." He didn't explain further. Elders' caution rarely comes with explanations, but that sentence stuck in my head like a burr. I told myself I was projecting fear onto empty words. Jay told me to stop looking. He said the marsh would get comfortable with me if I kept sticking my nose in. He never went back. The place became a scar in his voice, something he wouldn't name when people asked about fishing trips. He kept working, kept welding, kept making jokes. But at night he stopped sleeping deeply. Sometimes he'd wake up and rub his ankle like something had brushed it, and that gesture made me cold. Once, waking to the sound of someone moving in his shop, I found him standing with a flashlight pointed at his boots, watching the puddles as if they might stir. Our circle of friends changed. Good men started making the kind of jokes that are also warnings, and avoided the marsh when the thaw came. Others pulled their hoods down and went anyway, and I watched them leave with the same dread I feel watching children cross a busy street. Months have passed. Still, sometimes I hear things in the marsh. Low ripples forming without wind. Ice melting in perfect circles, like coins sliding downward. Sometimes I dream something wraps my calf when I walk barefoot into the sweet, reeking shallows of memory. The camera footage I took that day, grainy, water-blurred, shows very little. A smudge where darkness was a tug in the current, and Jay's hand flailing. It explains nothing. It will never be proof. If there's a lesson in this, it isn't about monsters. It's about how curiosity in some places sharpens until it becomes hunger, and about how places left alone for a long time have their own rituals of keeping. Marshes keep their own accounts. They remember feed, calls, and the sound of a good satellite phone syncing. We aren't always allowed to know why. Respect the borders between what we can safely study and what wants to remain hidden. Curiosity drives discovery, but it also draws attention. Caution isn't cowardice, and sometimes the wisest thing is to leave certain questions unanswered. Story 2. I grew up learning tricks for getting out of small places, not metaphors, literal tricks. How to slide open a jammed trailer door when the latch swelled with rain. How to wedge a toothpick under a warped lock. how to breathe through a hoodie when the air in a room tasted like old cigarettes and someone else's rage. My stepfather taught me, without meaning to, what panic smells like and what it sounds like when you swallow it. By the time I turned 19 and was on a plane headed for Nome, Alaska, I was already carrying a handful of those habits and a very convincing talent for pretending I wasn't terrified. Claire was the promise I clung to, an older sister who could serve as my anchor because she'd already anchored herself. She lived in a cabin on the edge of town and worked the nights at the clinic. I kept telling myself that a week in her small house would be a kind of rescue mission. Photography studies during the slow light hours, laughter over burnt coffee at midnight, and that kind of normal family life I'd only ever rehearsed in fantasies. The instability of my childhood had taught me to travel light. A duffel bag, a camera, and a stubborn hope that this time I'd find something solid. The plane landed and the sky looked like milk. Claire was stuck with the clinic schedule, so I drove alone with directions she'd scribbled on a torn index card. Half map, half advice. The roads were imitation ribbons under the snow. The signs blurred into one another when the wind picked up. I missed the turn. I pulled into what looked like a dead-end fuel depot to turn around. The place smelled like old rust and the ghost of a fire. A payphone crackled with static. I dialed Claire's number over and over until the signal sounded like it was underwater. I remember thinking absurdly that if something happened to me there, it would fit the stories I'd written in my head for years. Stories where the worst parts of childhood came back wearing a human face. 3 men came out from behind a shipping container as if they'd always been waiting in the dark. 2 of them laughed loudly, that laugh that never reaches the eyes. The other watched with a stillness that felt like a sharpened blade. They came close enough to fog the windows. I didn't have a plan beyond screaming for Claire or running, except running was impossible on the ice, and the wind in their presence would swallow any screams. At the back of my throat, I carried the residue of the same panic that had stuck to me in other borrowed rooms when my stepfather breathed too loudly. I thought about the tricks, about how I'd learned to talk first, to fill silence with sound so there was less time for someone to think about what they wanted to do to me. I'm not proud of what came next because it felt like an improvisation that turned cruel and necessary, but it's what saved me. I just shot someone, I said, loud and calm, like a person who'd rehearsed a confession for maximum effect. They're tracing this call. The cops will be here any minute. They froze. The sober one frowned, looking for a crack in my face. The 2 drunk ones glanced at each other and backed up, a little less sure of their swagger. The sober one said, "No way, not a chance." And he dragged his friends with him. They ran out into the snow and I stayed in the car with my hands sunk into the leather, squeezing until my knuckles hurt. When Claire finally showed up at her cabin door, eyes wide, worried, practical, she asked me the one question I'd hoped I'd never need to answer. "What did you say to them?" I told them a story, I said, and the words felt small and enormous at the same time. After that night, the police told me those men were connected to disappearances near the harbor. The idea that I'd walked away from a place other people didn't make it out of stuck to me like a pebble in my shoe. It pressed at the seams of the relief I felt that morning in Claire's kitchen. Relief that tasted like cold coffee, and relief's cousin, survivor's guilt. The nights at Claire's were quieter than I'd imagined. When the house exhaled, the sound of the heater and the distant hush of the ocean were enough for company. I started photographing small things, frost on the window, the way light tugged at a pine stump, the bruised blue sky. The camera calmed me. It turned everything into distance, into someone else's gaze. But the camera couldn't capture the slight tremor of my sleep. Weeks later, Claire woke me up to find me standing in the doorway, whispering the lie as if I were testing the consonants for practice. She sat me down, hands like a harbor. "You're sleepwalking," she said softly. And for a moment I was shocked that my body could perform a truth without my consent. I wanted to tell her I'd done it to survive, not to become some kind of living ghost repeating a trick. I wanted to tell her that story had been an act of survival, not a confession of anything else. At night, sometimes I heard footsteps in the snow outside the cabin. 3 crunches, then a pause, like someone testing the world to see if it would break. I pressed my back to the wall and counted breaths until the sound faded. Once, in the middle of the night, I opened the door with a flashlight in my hand. The snow was untouched and the forest was indifferent. There were no tracks, only the weight of the dark and the wind's whisper like a rumor. I started dreaming about their faces, the blunt coldness of the sober man, the loose-lipped sneer of the drunks. The dreams were less memory than reimagination. Scenes where I made different choices and still lost things. I began cataloging my days, what I'd done right, where I'd been blind. Guilt sat in my lap like a dog that refused to leave. Now people ask me if I was brave. I don't know what shape courage takes in skin that trembles when someone leans over the counter. The truth is complicated. Improvisation can look like courage only because the alternative is freezing in place. I told a story because it was the fastest weapon I could make with what I had on hand. Claire and I talked about boundaries and small safety practices, leaving a light on, keeping the phone charged, checking the locks. We learned to name the things that made me watch the dark. She listened without saying the things I was afraid of. Like how sometimes the ordinary life of a town can be full of predators who aren't dramatic villains, but ordinary men with appetites. I learned to trust that another person's presence could be a shield, but the world stayed ordinary. Life has that irritating way of continuing. My college assignments were calling. The semester moved toward final exams, and the city felt both impossibly far and inevitably close. I started to see the lie that saved me as a crack in my moral map, that strange place where need and guilt intersect. One afternoon, I went to the police station, out of curiosity and the need to make sense of everything. The officer who took my statement was careful and human. He didn't ask for dramatics. He asked what happened and what I saw. When I told him about the lie, he smiled without humor. Sometimes stories do more for us than facts, he said. He told me the men were known around the harbor area and that my description would help. It wasn't much, but it was real. Summer slid into Nome like a rumor. The snow pulled back and the harbor exhaled the smell of thaw. The men's faces showed up less often in my dreams. The footsteps outside the cabin grew rarer, as if the night had decided to forget me. I filed the experience under a title I couldn't quite name. Trauma, triumph, survival. And I kept walking. On the last night before I left, Claire and I sat on the front step and watched the sky take itself apart into color. "Do you think you can go back to school?" she asked, her voice like a careful boat. "I think so," I said, "but I'm not going to pretend nothing happened." The camera weighed in my bag, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like something I'd earned the right to carry. I learned there are stories you tell to get out of a room, and stories you tell to understand why that room existed. The one I used on the Porter strip saved me. The other one was going to take longer. As I drove away from Nome, I still expected to hear the ghost crunch of footsteps, to feel the hair rise on the back of my neck. Instead, I felt something lighter, a cautious confidence. I knew how to tell a story to buy time. I also knew how to ask for help, and how to listen to a friend who was already tuned to my signals. If there's one thing I want to leave the reader with, it's this. Improvisation can save you, but it isn't a long-term plan. It's a tool for a crisis, not a life built on it. After the lie, the real work was quieter. Learning to sleep without checking the windows. Learning to let someone else carry the fear for a while. Learning to measure risk without letting it define every decision. There's bravery in the quick, loud story that saves your life. And there's also bravery in the slow work of caring for what's left after the story has already been told. Sometimes surviving demands invention, but healing demands honesty, community, and the courage to let others hold the weight with you. Story 3. I grew up with maps spread across the kitchen table and case files tucked into the margins of my father's newspapers. By the time I was 24 and halfway through law school, I could read a room the way other people read weather. Quickly, out of habit, and with a low-grade anxiety that made me over-prepare. My dad was a detective. Old school, methodical. The kind of man who labeled emotions like they were evidence. He taught me to notice small things. The way someone's fingers found the rim of a glass. How their eyes avoided exits. That faint sense that clings to a jacket like it's a story. Those lessons made me careful, and sometimes they made me lonely. I learned to play distracted when it suited me. Laugh when a joke landed. Tilt my head like I couldn't be taken seriously. People let their guard down when they underestimate you. It was useful armor. We were in Juneau for winter break, a town that felt like a postcard, with snow-edged mountains and the harbor catching what little light the afternoon could offer. Mara had been my neighbor since childhood. Unflappable, loud. The kind of person at every party who can talk to strangers and make them feel like old friends. I like her because she gets me out of my own head. That night we planned something simple. A few drinks, loud music, and the brief illusion that adult responsibilities could be parked for a few hours. They sat down next to us before we even noticed. Two men with the posture of people who'd spent more time on boats than they'd spent on land. Fishermen, someone called them later, though in the bar they were just Travis and Knox. They were friendly enough. Easy laughs and those knowing glances that suggested an inside joke we weren't part of. When the bartender brought our drinks, they smiled, and later when we excused ourselves to use the bathroom, the way they leaned toward each other and murmured felt like a closed circuit I wasn't invited into. When I came back, something was wrong with the liquids in front of me. The men had ordered their drinks. I knew because I'd seen it, but 2 extra glasses had appeared. Cloudy and yellowish, like someone had stirred honey into something that shouldn't have held it. I went still. A memory rose up from one of my father's case files. Witnesses describing a strange sweet smell, the sickly haze that clung to a cup. My throat tightened. "Mara," I said under my breath. She looked up, oblivious. "Don't drink that." She gave me that expression that was half annoyed, half amused. "Catherine, relax. It's not poison." "Just switch them," I said. "Give them ours." She did it like I was being dramatic, but she did it. We slid the original glasses back where they belonged. I pretended to laugh, took a sip of my unchanged drink like a woman nothing could surprise. 20 minutes later, Travis's words started coming out in clumsy syllables, and Knox's head sagged as if the world had leaned its weight against him. They folded forward. The bartender dragged them off to the side like 2 customers who'd gotten too drunk. People treated it like a joke. A faintly sweet metallic smell floated in the room, like coins left in a jar. I kept my hand steady on my purse, and when Mara wanted to stay to call someone or make a scene, I pulled her gently toward the door. "Let them think whatever they want," I told her. "We're leaving." By the time we reached the sidewalk, the snow was coming down hard. The city softened into white. Footsteps sounded swallowed. In the car, Mara kept asking me why I hadn't called the police. Instead, I pictured the interrogation room. Questions about why we'd switched the drinks, why we didn't stay to check on the men. The inevitable suggestion that it had all been a misunderstanding. My father had taught me to choose my battles. Some things I decided get filed away in silence because every noise has a cost. That night I replayed the sequence over and over, like a tape that couldn't rewind. Travis's quick smile, Knox's leaned-in whisper, the way the bartender's eyes slid toward the door and then away. Days later, rumors drifted through town like debris on the tide. The men found barely conscious on a fishing boat said they'd been drugged in a bar. It wasn't much, but it was something. Everything else, the why, the docks, the unanswered destination, hung suspended in the air. The first week back at university, I pretended it had been an isolated incident, a loose strand of bad luck. But every time I walked past the waterfront on my way to file a case or return a book to the library, my steps shortened. The docks drew a line in my mind, a place where people could slip off the map and disappear into routine. I couldn't shake the idea that the cabin they'd suggested was a lie. Cabins make the story feel cozy, domestic, plausible. The docks, on the other hand, are where things can be done in full view and then explained away like nothing. A month later, I saw him again. Knox, standing near the marina, asking people about a brunette law student. In broad daylight, he looked ordinary, a wind-beaten cap, a jacket that had seen too many tides, hands that belonged to someone who made a living tying knots. He smiled when our eyes met. Maybe it was recognition or a test. The smile slid off his face when he realized I wasn't answering it with curiosity. "You okay?" he called from the dock, like kindness could cover the fear that had nested inside me. I kept walking. My father would have told me to watch, to note, to gather patterns. My instincts said to avoid the docks until night turned them into shadows too blurry to read. The men, found on their boat, stunned and mumbling that they'd been drugged, were treated as victims, but also as part of the town's nature, a place where help can be bought or delayed by distance. Some nights Mara called to make sure I hadn't turned into a hermit. "You can't live like some conspiracy caricature," she'd say, laughing to keep it light. "Go out. The world isn't just docks and knives." "Maybe not in your version," I would have said. We kept the ritual of friendship, dinners, study dates at the library, the safe small talk of people who love each other but don't want to dig too deep into fear. But every now and then we'd drive past the harbor and slow down just enough to feel the slick air. My stomach clenched every time, like a muscle remembering an injury. The men were charged with a minor public intoxication offense on the boat. The story unraveled even more into the paperwork of other people's lives. Insurance claims, liability questions, a fisherman's regret. No one asked the right questions about the glasses. No one asked what they'd said before the drinks. The town preferred tidy endings, and the law prefers facts you can hold up under light. I had a narrative, but it wasn't evidence. Months later, at a holiday party, I heard Knox's name in another context, spoken by someone trading gossip like currency. The voice said he'd been asking about the brunette law student. I felt that thin, cold tug in my chest again. Someone, somewhere, wanted to close a circle whose existence I refused to accept. I started carrying myself differently. It wasn't fear exactly. Fear makes you small. It was readiness, the training my father had drilled into muscle memory. I kept my phone ready, sat with my back to the wall in public places, and when strangers offered me rides, I smiled and said no. I didn't tell Mara for a while, not because she wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't want to be the friend who turns every coincidence into a crisis. But she found out anyway. "You did the right thing," she told me one morning over coffee, stirring sugar into her mug. "Trust that silence in your gut." "It's not trust," I said. "It's inventory." I never knew what they planned to do that night on the docks, whether the cabin was a disposable lure or part of a bigger script. In every story there are gaps, and some belong to the people who choose to stay hidden. What I did learn was how easily a room can change when someone decides to turn the ordinary into a weapon. A drink, a smile, the comfort of anonymity. I learned that the law sometimes is a blunt instrument, that justice often prefers a clean story. And I learned to be the kind of person who notices the smallest details and does something about them, even if that something is just leaving. Now when I walk through Juneau, I keep my distance from the water after dark. The town is still beautiful under cold light, gulls shrieking like static in the breeze. bow chains creaking like distant laughter. Deep down, I'm still a map maker, drawing possible routes from small clues. The men faded into other headlines, other cases, but I carry that night with me like a lesson stitched into a coat. Pay attention to the small everyday things. Your instincts exist for a reason, and remember that kindness should never blind you to caution. Vigilance can be an act of love toward yourself and toward the people you care about. Story 4. I left Seattle the way a man leaves a house that still smells like someone else's anger. Quickly, with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and every exit memorized. It wasn't one single thing that pushed me to leave. It was a slow accumulation of small alarms until one night made all the earlier whispers unbearable. My ex's stalker had been a shadow that started with calls and escalated to a knife. I still have the scar on my forearm, where I lifted my hand to protect her and felt the metal graze and split the skin. For months afterward, the hospital smelled like rubbing alcohol and fluorescent lights. Even after they took the stitches out, the habit of flinching at sudden noises never went away. So I took a job in Sitka, where people moved slower and the ocean kept hitting, over and over, like a metronome setting the town's rhythm. The air tasted like salt and diesel, and that fog that takes its time arriving and leaving. I wanted the anonymity of a place where your past doesn't walk behind you in plain sight. By day I fixed brakes and alternators. By night I learned to read faces weathered by time. I rebuilt engines until my hands understood the language of torque and rust. At first the nights were short and kind. I slept like a man with clean water and a key in his pocket. Then Halloween arrived and the silence rearranged itself. Plans with friends fell through because of bad weather. A kid got sick, whatever it was, and I ended up wandering into a thrift store on a whim, picking through shelves without looking for anything in particular. That's where I found the VHS tape, a horror movie in a cracked plastic case. The yellowed label was handwritten, like someone had made a mixtape out of fear. Something about that grainy promise felt right for a night I didn't want to spend scrolling through the phone's blue light. I took it home, made popcorn, and let the heater click and sigh. Small comforts in a house that had no history with me. The tape's static crackle felt like company. Shadows leaned over my walls, and the heater's uneven breathing sounded like a nervous animal. I tried to laugh at how jumpy I'd become over the years. The city teaches you to watch, to startle. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Halfway through the movie, there was a movement beyond the curtains, too deliberate to be wind. Slow, heavy, the kind of shift you read as human long before you make out a shape. I peeked through the blinds and saw a man in a soaked parka staggering down the street. He stopped and looked up at my house. It wasn't a quick glance. It was a fixation, a stare that seemed to have lost its purpose. His face was a blur under the hood, but his posture said intention. My stomach turned. I stepped to the peephole and watched him stay on the other side of the street, head tilted as if he were listening to something only he could hear. When the doorbell rang, my hand froze over the knob. The man was there, motionless, looking through the glass. I didn't open it. I pretended to be on the phone, turned my back on the door, and sat down again, like a man trying to convince himself nothing had happened. In time, the figure drifted back into the fog, retreating like a tide you didn't know was coming in. That night, I locked the doors with a clumsiness that made the chain rattle. At 2 a.m., there was a soft tapping on the back window, as if someone had decided to be patient. I grabbed the fireplace poker and raised the blinds. My breath fogged the glass, shoulders wider than the thinnest winter coats. Hands extended. The silhouette's breathing drew small, perfect halos in the cold. I yelled, and the figure fled into the trees like something that had only been waiting for permission to vanish. When the deputy sheriff took my statement, he wrote slowly and asked practical questions. "Any idea who it could be?" he asked. "No," I said, but he pressed calmly. "Boot prints." deep ones, like he hadn't been on the ground for long stretches, and with an uneven gait. He nodded, wrote it down, and told me to keep the lights on and call if anything else happened. The scrap of raincoat he handed me, they'd found it snagged on my fence the next morning, looked ordinary up close and ominous when I held it against the porch rail. After that, nights changed shape. Sounds that used to be background noise became edges I couldn't ignore. A branch cracking, a truck sighing past, an engine idling where it shouldn't. I started sleeping with the living room light on. The TV murmured like a lullaby I hadn't chosen. My friends joked about my paranoia. It was one of those things that, said in daylight, earns a laugh. At night, though, the laugh didn't fit. 3 weeks later, the deputy called. Another resident had reported someone trying to force a sliding door 2 streets over. The police language was, "Careful attempt, no entry, evidence collected." But the implication fit a pattern. I found a strange comfort in that bureaucratic steadiness. My fear wasn't alone anymore, and company can look like reason. I started checking the locks twice, the way a mechanic double-checks lug nut torque, methodically until it becomes muscle memory. I learned to keep the back door in my line of sight from the couch. I put a motion sensor light on the shortest threshold I could stand. Every small gesture felt like buying time. Every creak after midnight got attention. You can't stop the past from being part of you, but you can separate its reflections from your present. During one of those long vigils, I caught myself asking the question I'd avoided since Seattle. Was this about me or about something else? My ex's stalker had been personal, an obsession tied to one person. The man in the raincoat didn't seem motivated by who I'd loved or where I'd worked. It felt like a more hollow pattern, a presence that could target anyone who left a light on. That difference mattered. It suggested the danger was less personal vengeance and more predatory habit. Someone choosing targets by opportunity, houses that breathed and forgot to secure the back door. I started talking more with people, the kind of small conversations mechanics usually skip. Anyone lurking around your neighbor's place? Any weird van on the street? Everyone had a fragment, a late knock here, a homeless man there. Nothing fit like a map until you set the town's edges side by side. Predators move where the ground is easy. They choose places where caution has thinned. One afternoon I crossed paths with the man at the bait shop. Or rather, I saw him in the fogged glass before I realized his head turned with the same rhythm I'd learned to fear. He passed like a shadow with no intention of meeting mine. I clenched my jaw, and for a second, the world narrowed to the length of his stride. He was older than I expected. His patched parka had no brand, nothing distinctive except the way he moved. I didn't follow anyone. I stayed in the doorway, watching him dissolve into a streetlight's halo and then disappear. It was enough to know he existed outside the tape of my nightmares. Knowledge is a small comfort, but it's better than shapeless fear. The months folded into a pattern. Lights, locks, calls to the station that sometimes took too long and sometimes came too fast. The town stayed what it was. People who care within limits. Cops who do what they can. Neighbors who nod and don't get involved. I learned to live with the shadow without letting it rule the margins of my life. On weekends, I went out to the islands to work on engines with friends whose jokes were loud and uncomplicated. I dated someone once, briefly, testing whether I could trust another person with my story. I could, to a point. Some things you carry way more when you share them. Sometimes at night, when a slow step settled into the gravel beyond the porch light's reach, I stayed very still and listened. The footsteps stopped outside the glow at a polite distance, and I felt the old reflex to run, to hide, to raise the poker rising in me like a tide. But I learned to breathe through it, to name the terror instead of letting it name me. I learned to call the deputy without shame when a figure cut itself out of the darkness, to lean on the net of a community that isn't perfect but is persistent. As far as I know, the man in the raincoat never came back to my porch. If he left, if he moved away, or if he keeps his distance in ways I can't detect, I don't know. What I do know is this. Trauma makes noises sound louder and shadows feel closer. It would be easy to let fear become a permanent address, to move again and again until the world becomes a catalog of safe zones. Instead, I fixed the heater, learned to change the locks myself, and kept working on engines because physical work steadied my hands. One morning on the way to the shop, I passed a kid on a skateboard who waved at me. I waved back. The world, in its slow way, offered small, ordinary kindnesses. A hand on a shoulder, a spare part for a stubborn carburetor, a neighbor sweeping his step. Those things didn't erase the footprints or the piece of coat snagged on my fence, but they taught me another balance between vigilance and the act of living. The night when the tape, the taps, and the parka collapsed into one long thread, I could have let it tie me up. Instead, I took the knowledge, the tools, the community, and the stubbornness I learned in Seattle, and I adjusted them into something I could stand on. You can't live only from fear. Prepare, protect yourself, and stay alert. Yes, but also invest in ordinary connections and everyday routines. They're the best defense against being defined by the worst nights you've survived. Story 5. I grew up with a shutter in my hands and a map in my backpack. My mother taught me to see light the way some people learn to read. Slowly, carefully, paying attention to the places others pass right by. My brother Eli was the opposite, a surge of motion. A man who threw himself at cliffs and trails and called it living. The last time I saw him, he was laughing, adjusting his pack, promising me photos when he got back. He never came back from that hike in Oregon. I kept telling myself I should have gone. I'd canceled the trip for a job that couldn't be rescheduled. Guilt moves inside you like tide water. Slow, insistent. And that's why I left everything I could for a remote cabin on Kodiak Island, thinking solitude and lenses would teach my grief to speak more softly. The cabin sat beyond a road that gave up its name and became a track, a stretch where the spruces leaned into the wind and fog came off the sea with a softness that felt like an eraser. I told the rental owner I didn't want anything. No neighbors, no visitors. I wanted to disappear, to unspool between pines and rain, and lose the part of me that made plans and failed them. My camera was a talisman and a witness. I photographed bears, gulls, and that particular geometry of cliffs. The island gave back images that seemed to study me for a moment, but the nights were long and I was practicing sleep, like someone who'd forgotten the steps. The first night of knocking, I thought it could be anyone. A neighbor, a lost fisherman. The kind of human interruption that in other lives would have felt normal. I moved quietly to the door, looked through the small pane of glass and saw only fog, soft and imprecise, swallowing the porch light. The knocking continued. One patient tap, then another, steady as a heartbeat. My rational mind whispered explanations. Someone drunk, a misplaced hammer, the wind settling an old porch. When I opened the door, no one was there. The stepboards held only rain, but 5 small wet footprints led away into the dark like punctuation marks. Barefoot, child-sized, vanishing between the spruces as if someone had walked there and melted. I have a photo of Eli's footprints from a beach trip years ago, sand compacted into the small architecture of a stride. The shape of those prints stabbed me with memory. I should have laughed, shut the door, and told myself that was that. Instead, I stood staring at the trees until my teeth hurt. Over the next nights, the rhythm grew. Doors that dawned unlatched. Boots moved from where I'd stacked them. The camera powered on, lens aimed at the tree line. In the file, a minute or two of nothing, and a faint breath. Something held just out of frame. Once a clip showed a blurry figure between trunks, vague as a dream, but placed where a child would be when you look and there isn't one. The logic of sleeplessness said I was making things up. The part of me that works with exposure and detail said the images were evidence of light hitting something real. On the second foggy night, a storm cut the power. I lit candles and tried to steady hands that wouldn't stop shaking. When the rain eased, I followed the fresh prints behind the cabin with a headlamp and a flashlight, because those prints had been there in daylight and stamped in mud, and I couldn't not look. The trail led to a rise that wasn't much, a mound swallowed by moss and root, a place where the island seemed to fold over itself. There, almost hidden by ferns and rot, was a wooden door set into the slope. Old boards, iron hinges with straps, a handle worn by hands I wanted to recognize. I heard whispering behind the door, not the frantic whisper of someone in panic, but a measured repetition, like someone practicing a name. The voice said, "My name." It was Eli's voice in the way memory reproduces accents, timbre, and turns of phrase until you hear what isn't there. I rested my palm on the wood without meaning to, and it was warm, as if someone had been there very recently. 4 more steps would have put me at the latch. I'm stubborn in the ways grief makes you stubborn, and I almost took that rusted handle. Then 3 knocks sounded inside the cabin, and then exactly the same rhythm I'd heard at my door. It was a small, ordinary pattern, but in that moment it felt like an answer. I stumbled back as if someone had yanked a rope. Whatever was behind that door wasn't going to come out because of my longing. I left that night with iron in my mouth and the certainty that I wasn't allowed to force the world open the way I wanted to. At the ranger station, they were kind. Rangers live on thin strips of land and know how fast weather, hunger, and human intent can turn things. They took my story seriously enough to bring me back to the rise in daylight and search among the spruces. But there was nothing. The ground had that clean undulation years of moss and rain leave behind. No boards, no hinges, no boot prints. The ground gives up its secrets in other seasons, they told me, but not today. They wrote down my name and offered hot coffee and suggestions like, stay with a friend and don't go out alone at night. It was practical advice, the kind of help the world can offer when it wants to behave well without promising miracles. That afternoon I packed because the island felt too intimate and because the edges of reality had become too thin. I told the rental owner I was leaving, and she didn't ask why. Island people are used to evacuations and disappearances. She took the key and the change like she had a habit of returning things that didn't belong to her. Later in town, an elderly woman I met at the market told me, "The sea keeps its children close." I took it as a harmless proverb, until afterward it started to feel like something deeper. I tried to explain the experience to friends in the city, and their eyes slid off me politely, the way they do when they hear something that can't be easily classified. Maybe I sounded like someone half asleep who thinks shadows are architecture. Maybe the storm had loosened something in the cabin's wiring. Maybe the camera glitched. Maybe I saw Eli because I needed him so badly I was hallucinating him. Those are reasonable ideas. Science and sanity. 2 careful hands framing something too sharp to hold. But then my phone camera would turn on by itself at night and take a single frame of nothing. And if I cranked the volume to a ridiculous level, I could hear the faintest sound. 3 taps in the dark. There are ways of witnessing grief that scientists don't put into a methodology. I found myself standing on the ferry back to the mainland, cold and solemn, scrolling through videos and photos until my eyes burned. Sometimes a rational explanation sits under you like a solid, reassuring ledge. Sometimes there's only the drop in the memory. People said leaving was sensible. They meant physical safety. They meant pulling away from a place that reminded me of absence. I left because the island had offered me an invitation that felt too costly. Grief is terrain with edges that erode differently for everyone. For me, the slope was sudden, and I wasn't ready to tumble. I wanted to make a home again in a city where lights flicker for reasons an electrician can fix, and where a knock on the door means someone arrived for tea. Months later, my camera, which I keep on my nightstand for reasons I can't even explain, sometimes shows a new file at 3 a.m. The image is always a frame of darkness, sensor noise, like static. And when I boost the audio, there's that faint breath. And then after a long, thin pause, 3 small taps. I've stopped deleting those clips. They live in a folder named for the place I ran from. And sometimes in the blue light of my kitchen at dawn, I play them and listen. Because listening feels like a kind of devotion. An admission that a world made of loss has permission to exist. I learned a lesson without wanting to learn it. Some doors are meant to stay closed, not because there's danger on the other side, but because the small acts of opening and closing them are prayers we aren't always ready to answer. Grief will knock in a rhythm you learn to memorize. Sometimes the right response is to sit with the sound and press your hand flat against the door until the tapping becomes memory instead of a summons. Grief and curiosity demand attention, but they ask different things of us. Sometimes the kindest response is restraint. Honoring our losses doesn't mean chasing every echo. And some doors, whether in memory or in the earth, are better treated with patience and respect than with a forced entry. Story 6. I moved back to Fairbanks because I needed distance that felt like a real border. Anchorage had been a slower kind of violence, small things stacking up until I could barely breathe. Here at 33, with the snow closing in and a neighborhood that puts up more fake gravestones than some cemeteries, I thought I could start rebuilding the parts of me that weren't broken. Halloween was the first holiday that felt safe. Kids shrieking from sugar highs, porch lights, 100 front doors open at the same time. I told myself I could handle one night of sticky wrappers and laughing ghosts. I was wrong, first in the smallest way, and then in the biggest. The first time I saw her, it was barely a blink on my front step. She took the candy without looking up. Her face was dusted white, like someone had tried to paint a ghost with kitchen flour. She wore a thrift store satin dress, the kind that catches light in the worst way. Underneath, she had boots that wouldn't stop tapping against the porch boards. The man with her stood an arm's length behind her back. He wore a navy parka zipped so high I couldn't see his jaw. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just hovered, like a shadow that had learned to walk. "Happy Halloween," I said, because that's what you say when kids come to your door. The girl's lips parted and her eyes, rimmed with black makeup, found mine for a second. She smiled, or maybe it was just the illusion of a face painted to look like a smile. And then she was gone. The man lingered for a moment inside the streetlight's halo, and when the porch light shifted toward the neighbor's step again, he dissolved into the crowd. That night, sleep weighed heavier than usual. I got into the shower to get the smell of cheap cigarettes out of my hair and to force myself through some small domestic ritual. Near the end, when the water started cooling and the steam drew a thin haze over the bathroom mirror, my phone buzzed on the sink. "Front door camera detected motion," it said. I opened it, squinting into the pixelated grain. There she was again, on my porch. She steps into frame and looks straight into the lens, like she can see the whole world inside a single square of glass. She whispers something. The audio comes through muffled, like she's speaking through wool. And then the camera catches a faint sound from inside the house, like someone stirring a pan in the kitchen or dragging a foot down the hallway. The girl turns. The man appears at the edge of the frame, and then they both step away. The timestamp reads 11:47 p.m. I should have called the police right then. I wasn't even wearing a robe. Instead, I opened the garage door because sometimes instincts are a mix of courage and stupidity. I crossed the hall with a towel in my hand, heart racing, palm slick, and the house felt too big, too full of echo. The back door was locked. The noise I'd heard sounded like a breath trapped between pipes. I went into the kitchen intending to find the source and instead found the sliding door to the garage lifted slightly from underneath. The metal edge was pushed up, like someone had gotten their hands under it and raised it. I called 911 from my neighbor's porch, shaking so hard my voice trembled when I tried to explain where I lived. The officers were kind but efficient. They took my statement with professional neutrality, a softness I appreciated and resented at the same time. They dusted the garage door for prints, walked the perimeter, and took a copy of the video. A lot of people don't realize these doors can be lifted by hand, one officer said. We've seen several cases this year, older models, weak springs. Someone can get a hand in, lift it, and walk right in. He took notes. He didn't promise anything. Afterward, neighbors told me they'd seen the pair 2 nights earlier, prowling around a row of houses in the cul-de-sac, testing handles and peering into fogged windows like they were measuring the thickness of someone's life. They'd called it weird. We used words like unsettling and creepy over coffee and small-town gossip. We installed motion sensor lights. I slept with my back against the wall and stayed dressed for a week. We're a neighborhood that pays attention. Maybe because up here the weather will kill you faster than strangers if you get careless. So when police came back with a report of other similar break-ins, a pattern started drawing itself in our heads. Old garage doors, a girl dressed as a bride, a tall man in a plain parka. I spent hours watching the footage the police gave me on a loop, as if repeating it could teach me a different ending. In some clips, the man guides the girl by the elbow, his voice close to her ear. Sometimes she moves like a puppet. Sometimes she moves like a child who trusts an adult. I started talking about it less. Talking felt like giving the thing air, but silence had its own weight. I learned faces. A neighbor's wife whose purse was almost snatched at midnight, and a porch light that went out right as the pair passed. A kid down the street whose dad saw the girl standing alone by the birch line the next week, pale as the moon, and at first thought it was an old prom dress flapping in the wind. My sleep broke. Several nights I woke at 3 a.m. and listened for footsteps on the back deck, like I was waiting for the world to decide whether I'd be brave enough or stupid enough to open the door. A detective called me a week later and asked whether the girl had seemed strange. Not strange, I said. Just quiet, like someone had taught her to breathe slowly. He didn't say maybe she was a runaway. He didn't say maybe she was a trafficked teenager. He didn't say what I wanted to hear. He said they were running ballistic tests on some stolen items they'd found at a pawn shop, and that the video would help. It was the bureaucratic version of hope. Months passed. Winter sank its claws in. The girl in the wedding dress showed up a few more times on our security cameras, always accompanied by night air and birch trunks. Once, a neighbor swore he saw the dress moving between the trees, like a figure folding into the landscape. Another time, a teenager uploaded a shaky video of the girl sitting at the edge of the park, head tilted, and people said it was art or a threat. Then they called the police, who found only footprints in the snow going off in different directions. At some point, we stopped expecting a neat resolution. The man in the parka vanished from the footage more often than he appeared. The girl's presence split the neighborhood's imagination in two. Some said she was a living human, scared, used as bait. Others started whispering that maybe she wasn't alive, that the paleness wasn't makeup, that something was wrong with the way she moved, like death had taught her to walk. I tried to go back to work, to the small satisfactions of code that compiles and coffee that tastes like a promise. I tried dating someone, letting someone sit close to me on the bus, taking my shoes off without checking under the bed. The first winter I spent in Fairbanks after that Halloween, I dreamed of the girl's eyes opening in the dark and woke with a copper taste in my mouth. There were barricade nights when I slept with the porch light on, and there were days when I went into the office with a smile so big my coworkers asked if I'd lost my mind. The police never made an arrest. I heard about cases going cold. The girl and the man folded into the inventory of things that happen in small towns. Stories told over fences and casseroles. Something terrifying that happened and still never fully stepped into daylight. I put an extra deadbolt on the back door and a second lock on the garage. I learned to speak louder at neighborhood watch meetings and to move more quietly when I walked alone after dusk. I watched my neighbors' faces soften when they saw me in the morning. A mutual check-in. "You still here? You okay?" Sometimes late, when night presses its face to my window and the birches whisper with snow, I pull up the camera feed and watch a pixelated girl cross the lawn. It's always the same video. Clipped, low resolution, insufficient. And still, I keep hoping it will change. That one day the footage will show the chase, the arrest, the conversation that makes sense of the silence. That hope is a small, persistent ember. Sometimes safety isn't a default setting. It's built with locks, with lights, with neighbors who look up from their phones. But more than that, safety is also refusing to let fear stay silent and private. Call the police. Tell your neighbor. Put up more lights than you think you need. And when you see a pale girl on your porch, whether she's a child painted for a party or something darker, don't be ashamed of the small courage it takes to ask for help. The world doesn't owe us miracles. It owes us vigilance. Story 7. I grew up with the smell of diesel and the echo of avalanche sirens lodged in my ears. My father carried that siren like a talisman. Between sips of coffee, he told me stories about line crews and rescue runs. And I learned to measure time by the way snow scrapes metal when he disappeared on a rescue mission in Montana. The mountains didn't simply take him. Instead, they left me with a small, constant panic that tightened my ribs every time I looked at an open sky. To cure that fear, I didn't take therapy or pills. I chased the opposite of everything that scared me. I signed up for a winter geology internship in Barrow because the tundra is a white ocean. Flat, endless, indifferent. If I stared at the horizon long enough, I told myself, maybe the panic would get bored and leave. The locals smiled at my plan the way you smile at a kid who wants to ride a bike into a storm. They told me about the wind, frostbite, how twilight settles over the land like a bruise. And they warned me about the old radar station, a Cold War relic crouched on a rise a few miles off the research route. Don't go out there alone, an elder told me over coffee at the community center. His fingers were stained with cigarette ash. Not because of the place, kid, because at night you can hear engines, machines that shouldn't be running anymore. I nodded. I filed the warning the way people file small discomforts. I planned the route, checked the sled, and told myself I was brave in a way that wasn't really bravery. The morning I went, the sky had the texture of bone. My exhalations puffed and froze in the air, and every movement felt amplified. Boots on packed snow, the dull thud of the snowmobile warming up, the groan of the track as I eased forward. The research trail had been polished by the previous week's traffic, faint grooves where others had cut through the flat, an occasional fishbone pattern where the wind had piled drifts. At first I drove slowly, letting the machine and I remember each other. The radar station appeared as a black silhouette on the horizon, a stubby thumb against a sea of white. It looked dead and honest, and somehow older than the wars that built it. Halfway there, I noticed another set of tracks running parallel to mine. They didn't look freshly made at first glance. They trailed a few lengths behind me, the ghost of a track keeping me company. As I rode, I glanced over and my stomach dropped. Whoever made them had been precise, perfectly straight grooves, too straight. Where the terrain curved, those marks kept cutting a line through space. Where snow mounds rose, those tracks didn't climb. They plowed through as if the machine weighed more than physics allows. It hadn't snowed since those lines were laid down. There were no human footprints, no plastic scraps, nothing out of place, just those two patient, impossible lines. I waited to hear another engine, the buzz of some mentor, or some fool behind me. But there was only my own engine in the wind, making a cage of air around my helmet. When I reached the station, the front door hung open like a question. The inside air didn't smell like rot, but like old electronics and a faint persistent warmth, as if something had been left on. The fluorescent lights flickered to life and died in slow cycles. Radios on a table crackled with static and then cut out, and a speaker in one corner whispered a broken signal. A low, distorted voice that could have been a recording that forgot how to stop. I said hello, and my voice sounded thin, swallowed by old insulation and the memory of footsteps. On the wall were diagrams, maps and lines with dates from decades ago. In one corner, a chair faced a window, as if someone had sat there waiting for something that never came. The tracks circled the building. At first I thought I'd misread the pattern in the snow, but up close I saw it clearly. It wasn't one circle, but several, concentric, traced with obsession, as if a machine had been drawing patterns in the white around the station all night long. They weren't straight anymore. Now they were impatient, curving inward and opening back up, like whatever made them had been waiting and searching. The hair rose on the back of my neck, that old animal gesture. This is ridiculous, I told the empty room. The only answer was the click of some relay inside the walls. I went outside to take photos, to leave evidence in pixels, and then I heard it, low and distant, a rumble that vibrated through the soles of my boots. At first I thought it was suggestion, or my own heart, or a truck on some far road. But the sound grew until it was undeniable, a deep, patient engine note. I turned, and I saw it, a huge silhouette beyond the crest, looming with no visible operator. It had the shape of a snowmobile, but it was too big, like someone had taken the idea and scaled it up into something it built to crush ice. Its lights flickered like a dying signal lamp. It revved with no hand on the throttle, and then it lunged straight at me. No one tells you how fast panic can make your legs move. I ran, jumped onto my sled, gunned it. My engine's roar matched the machine behind me. The chase was a geometry of terror. White straight, the world reduced to speed. The station shrinking behind me like a dark coin. The other sled held my pace with an unnatural ease. It didn't pass me. It filled my mirror. It breathed heavy through the cutting wind. I looked once and saw there was no one riding it. No hunched human shape. No reflective visor. Just the long black bulk and the hungry arch of its tracks. I drove like my life would end if I stopped. I left the station behind. Then the ridge opened and the pursuit continued, like a bad joke that no longer had anything left to make you laugh. After a while, my sled's engine squealed in protest. My hands went numb from gripping so hard. My throat tasted like metal. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the rumble cut out, stuttered, and died. Silence dropped on me, thick and immediate. I stopped, gasping, fingers white on the handlebars. I looked back. The tracks behind me were erased with perfect cleanliness, as if someone had swept the snow. No grooves, no marks, nothing. The only sign was the impression of my 2 lines leading me back home. That night, when I walked into the community center, the elders made me sit down like I was a child bringing a story they already knew. Their faces carried the map of a hard life, wind-worn wrinkles, eyes soft and tough at the corners. "You saw it," the oldest one said, plain. "You heard a ghost machine." They told me what they knew, knowledge passed along like poorly cared for tools. The radar station sat on ground where rescue crews had disappeared more than once during the whiteout storms. Men went out, and engines died. And later their machines showed up in strange places. Engines still warm, drivers somewhere else. They called them machines you can't shut off. Engines that keep searching for what they were chasing in life. They come back, the elder said. Maybe to finish a job. Maybe just to remember the run. I quit the internship the following week. People called it a safe decision in a context that didn't mean anything to me anymore. What felt safest was the idea of getting my nights back in Barrow. I slept with a radio on and the curtains pulled tight. But the sound of an engine idling has a way of getting into your skull. Sometimes late, I hear it outside my window. A long, patient cycle, like someone clearing their throat. I go to the door to check, and by morning the snow shows nothing strange. Clean paths, animal tracks. A sunrise that denies the rumor of the night before. The elders would say that's the collision of different truths. What chases doesn't always leave marks. I've tried to turn my fear into study. I read old accident reports and weather logs. I looked for a sensible explanation. A sound mirage, a wind trick, the mechanical echo of two machines traveling together. But nothing feels like an answer meant to stay with me. Science comforts, but it's a poor substitute when what you remember is the buzz of an engine that won't forget a lost run. Sometimes I imagine that ghost machine as grief turned mechanical, an engine unable to release its purpose, still searching until it finds what it was supposed to save, or what it failed to save. Maybe it's all a rationalized myth, frozen imaginations, too much time and too little light. Maybe those tracks that don't curve were made by men with bad bearings. Maybe the circles around the station were drawn by pranksters. Those answers would be kinder to my mind. Instead, I have the image of a dark shape accelerating on a windless afternoon. Something haunting a place built to listen for enemies that are now only weather. Machine or metaphor, it taught me a particular humility. That some landscapes remember the past mechanically. That places where people died hold an echo. And that certain questions don't want to be solved as much as they want to be mourned. There are places where history accumulates like layers of snow, loss and habit, and sometimes the safest courage is knowing when to turn back. Curiosity can teach, yes, but there are wounds in the world that demand respect more than excavation.